Tomlin shook his head as though he couldn't comprehend why Lee wasn't following. Don't you get it? They want you gone so you're not wasting what's in the bunkers. If the infected ever die out along the East Coast, they want to be able to come back in, and they want to be able to use your bunkers to resupply. They can't open the bunkers if I'm dead. Tomlin shook his head slowly, side to side. Not true, Lee. Abe was issued a master code. He can hand it out to whoever he wants, and if they put it in their GPS instead of the individual code, they can access whatever bunker they want. He paused for a long time as though waiting for Lee to ask a question, but Lee only stood there, shell-shocked into silence. Mitchell was one of the last northeastern states. The only ones that survived were Pennsylvania and New York, only because they were able to get onto the other side of the Appalachians. They took heavy losses when they did. Chris and Lucas, Lee said, picturing their faces. Yes, they had to abandon portions of their states, and the others, Mark from Delaware, James from Maryland, Ian from New Jersey, we lost contact with all of them within the first month. So when acting President Briggs began running things, and then Mitchell disappeared, Abe contacted me and ordered me to discontinue my operations in South Carolina, find you, kill you, and retreat across the Appalachians. In the strange midnight light of the room, Lee could see the tears in Tomlin's eyes. I had people, Lee, women and children, entire fucking families. His face suddenly contorted. And I left them behind. I left them with supplies running low and the weather getting cold. And I came up here and I watched you. I watched you putting everything you had into this. I watched you taking the people and keeping them safe, doing what you were supposed to do. He blinked to clear his eyes. I couldn't do it. I couldn't kill you. Overwhelmed, Lee slumped against the wall and buried his face into his hands, as though the barrier of them would block out any other unpleasant things trying to force their way into his mind. His dream just prior to waking still clung to him like strands of spider silk. The distinctness of the threat, the inevitability of demise, but also of the nearness of his father and the determination and the strength he drew from it. Tomlin's voice hijacked his train of thoughts. It's bigger than my personal convictions. Muffled by his palms, Lee said, How is that? I told you about the master code, but there was something else. Apparently, our GPS devices can link to each other and be controlled remotely. With the proper codes, one can be slave to another. When Abe briefed us before we left our bunkers, he had us all link our devices. Tomlin looked down at his hands. When they made the decision to abandon the East Coast, he remotely accessed my device and changed the security restrictions so that I couldn't even access my bunkers if I wanted to. Lee removed his hands from his face. Tomlin was staring at him with bald intensity. They couldn't slave my device, Lee said, the voice of someone coming to a severe and unwelcome realization, because I wasn't there to link mine with everyone else. I'm the only one who can still freely access their bunkers. Tomlin nodded. I need your help, Lee. Why should I help you? Tomlin's voice rose. Because it's not right. They can't just decide who lives and dies, who gets rescued and who gets left behind. We were given a fucking job, and I'm not done doing mine, and you're not done doing yours. Tomlin pointed to the ground with his index finger. We're still here. North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia are still here. We haven't been overrun yet. Why give up when we've got a plan to stop it? Lee looked at him sharply. You mean I have a plan to stop it? We can help each other here, Lee. Lee looked at the other man for a long time. He drew his knees up and leaned his elbows on them. The question was whether he could trust Captain Tomlin or not. To that question, he had to ask himself, has he done anything to hurt you? And of course the answer would be no. Tomlin may have come here with the intention to harm him, under misinformation and a misguided sense of duty, but he hadn't carried it out. Then, of course, the next question was, has he done anything to earn your trust? Well, he didn't kill me when he had the chance. Lee cleared his throat. What do you know about my plan? They spoke for a long time. Lee explained his plan in detail because, in his mind, he didn't have much of a choice. Sometimes when the stakes were high, you had to make a bet that you wouldn't normally make. In this situation, Lee just had to bet that Tomlin was on their side. He also told Tomlin what Jacob had briefed them on when he'd first come to Camp Ryder, and the threat that they faced in the coming months. As they talked, Lee found that they were slipping easily back into sync with each other, the familiar rhythms of an old friendship that fit you like a well-worn pair of boots. The coordinators were a family, and they all knew each other well. Lee had been closest to Abe Daraby, but he'd naturally founded friendships with Tomlin and Mitchell, simply because they were both within a couple hours of him. Then, with everything that had happened the previous day, with the uniformed soldiers trying to kill him, and Tomlin suddenly surfacing, Lee had struggled to reconcile what he was witnessing with what he knew about these men, particularly Tomlin. Now, in the dim glow of a lantern, standing shoulder to shoulder and addressing the map that hung on the wall of the office, Lee felt an immense relief, like hot water relaxing his muscles and releasing the tension in him. Tomlin was still a friend, which left the question of Abe Daraby, who was clearly having his hand forced by the acting president. Tomlin turned and looked at Lee, very serious. Lee, you need to decide right now whether or not you recognize the authority of Secretary of State Briggs as acting President of the United States. It's a tough question to resolve, but don't wait until you're backed into a corner to figure it out. He seemed to have read Lee's mind. What have you decided? I decided that I don't recognize the authority of the Secretary of State, because I have no proof that the presidential successors preceding him are indeed dead. All we have is his word, which is worth zilch to me right now. Until it's proven otherwise, in my mind, the president is still commander-in-chief, and I will abide by the last orders that I know came from him: rescue and rebuild. Not leave the eastern seaboard for the infected. Lee smiled. I second that. From inside the Camp Ryder building, Lee heard a door slam, what sounded like the front double doors. Then came the pounding of footsteps on metal risers. What time is it? Lee asked, glancing over to the small window in the office. The window was clouded with condensation, but Lee could see it was still dark outside. Tomlin cringed. This is probably going to be about me. The door to the office burst open and there was a man there, one of the sentries, standing there with his rifle at the ready. He took a moment to process what he was seeing, and his body went rigid. He swung his rifle in the general direction of Tomlin, but didn't aim. Captain. Lower that rifle for me, Lee gestured with his hand. The man lowered his rifle but pointed with his free hand. He escaped. He got away. Lee felt a smile on his lips, clearly. The sentry seemed to realize that Lee and Tomlin were in no life-and-death struggle, and that there was a little bit of amusement in their eyes as they looked at him. His face flushed, and his eyes searched the ground. I'm sorry, Captain. I fell asleep. Lee shrugged. Well, luckily, this time no one got hurt. In the future, if you feel like you're too exhausted to perform your duties, try and find someone to replace you. It's almost freezing temperatures out there. If you're dozing off when it's that cold, you probably need to get more sleep. The sentry relaxed a bit. I'm sorry. Lee waved him off, and the man disappeared through the door, his shoulders slumped slightly. Looking to Tomlin, Lee raised an eyebrow. How did you get out of a locked shipping container? Tomlin smiled sheepishly. One of the back corners is almost completely rusted through, a little prying with a metal pipe, and I was able to squeeze out. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. He must really have been asleep not to hear that shit. Guess we won't be using that container for a holding cell anymore. Lee turned his attention back to the map. Listen, Brian, I'm sorry for all of that. Tomlin considered that for a long time. We're in desperate times, Lee. I'd have done the same damn thing if I were in your position. There's no need to apologize for taking precautions. Lee's lips tightened. It's good to have you. Tomlin looked at the floor. Yeah. Do you think you'll be able to go back? To South Carolina? Yeah. I dunno, probably not to the same people. I left them without explanation. They're one day and gone the next. Tomlin smiled grimly. No, all I can do for them now is help you stem the tide. Maybe once all this is over and I can explain why I left, he trailed off. Once all of this is over, Lee said with a chuckle. Yeah, why? You don't think it's going to be over? I'm sure it will one day, but it's going to be a long damn time. LaRouche woke up slowly from a poor night's sleep. He slept for periods of perhaps an hour, only to wake up with strange dreams that flew away from the grasp of his recollection and left him feeling on edge. The last time he awoke it was past 3 a.m., and he figured there was no purpose in continuing to try to sleep. He felt more exhausted each time he woke. The nervousness of the coming day would not allow him to rest tonight, so he would wait, and perhaps tomorrow, when they were on the road and the mission was in progress, he would sleep better. He lay in his bed, a few thick blankets laying atop cardboard, for a long time, staring at the ceiling of his shanty and watching the tiny space between the two sections of plywood that comprised his roof shift from black into deep hues of blue. Cold air surrounded him, and the air from his lungs turned to fog and drifted up to the crack in the ceiling. He waited for the sounds of other people, but it was still too early and time was sluggish in the cold, pre-dawn hours. He was only growing more impatient. Fuck it, he mumbled and threw the covers off. He was still mostly dressed. It was just too damn cold at nights to strip down, so the only thing missing was his boots. He slipped them on and shuffled his feet around in them, trying to impart his body heat to the cold leather interior by creating some friction. He left them unlaced and grabbed his rifle. It was too early in the morning for his tactical vest, too early for rifles, for that matter. He pushed away the multiple layers of blankets and one tarp that served as his door. He probably had more blankets in his shanty than most, and he rarely left a blanket behind when he found it. They were cushion, warmth, and insulation. LaRouche had never realized how essential and how useful a blanket could be. Outside his shanty, he looked up at the sky and found stars staring down at him, clear and crystalline. Dawn was still an hour away, and to the untrained eye, the sky was still dark. But a person that lies awake in the cold nights can see even the slightest change in the color of the sky. Gonna be a clear day, maybe even a little warm. He meandered between shanties full of sleeping families and couples, people that had someone else to cling to in the night, someone to give them warmth and comfort. It struck him that modern society had robbed something from people when their lives and beds were so comfortable that they preferred to sleep alone. Man wasn't meant to spend these nights by himself. The pleasure of human company in these hard times overcame any number of personality quirks that would have become deal breakers in the old world. We got so picky, he thought to himself. My steak's not cooked right, and my bed doesn't align my spine properly, and my wife just put on some weight. Who gives a fuck? LaRouche could recall any number of women that he dated, only to delete them from his phone and avoid them at all costs because their laugh was weird, or she left her wet towel on the bathroom floor, or she had too many cats. Now he'd give anything to have one of those women in his bed at night, warm and soft, and maybe, just maybe, he'd sleep the whole night through. Like the rest of these fuckers. LaRouche made a face as he passed a shanty that was rumbling with someone's loud snoring. How did you sleep that deeply when it was almost 30 degrees out? Unbelievable. He reached the large circle of ash ringed with stones. He knelt down over the rocks and held his hand close above the ashes. There was still some heat there. He stepped over to a large and mysterious mound that sat a few yards from the fire pit, covered by a tarp. He lifted the tarp and tossed it back halfway, revealing a stack of wood and kindling. God bless all the people that did the chores around here. The hunting and the gathering and the splitting wood for fires. Of course, LaRouche had his own job to do, and it came with its own unique set of challenges, but not once had he gone to this stack of wood and found it depleted. He grabbed up an armload of kindling and 2 split logs and carried them to the side of the fire. He brushed the ashes away and revealed the glowing embers underneath. He placed the kindling over this patch of coals and blew on it steadily until the embers began to blaze hotly and the kindling caught. Slowly but surely, he nursed the fire back to life. He stared into the flames for a long time, feeling the heat on his face as the fire began to envelop the split logs, the splinters burning and curling back on themselves, the bark beginning to steam and bubble as what little moisture was left inside of it boiled. In those long, hypnotic moments, his mind left him and traveled to a kitchen with white cabinets and gray granite countertops and the smell of strong coffee. His parents' house in Tennessee. The bright, early morning light seeping through the bay windows of the breakfast nook. The way the sun felt warm coming through the windows, but you could look outside and see the frost shimmering on everything. The way the house felt almost too hot when you came in from the outside, the vents kicking out air that smelled of home, a box of a dozen fresh donuts in his hand. That was breakfast, and would be the only thing they ate until Thanksgiving dinner in the early afternoon. A dozen donuts to fuel a day of turkey frying, cigar smoking, and backyard football. He thought of their faces. His mother, his father, his younger brother. Faces that would gather around the island and look at each other with that tired affection of waking up to a full house of long-lost family in town for the holidays. Tired, but comfortable in their belonging. He missed them, but he tried not to think about them, because he knew they were probably dead. It felt cold of him to think it, but he wouldn't fool himself into a false hope. The LaRouche family was nothing if not pragmatic, and they would not want him to labor under the assumption that they had survived against all odds. They'd lived just outside of Nashville and likely hadn't made it. His dad would run a hand over his thick salt and pepper goatee and adjust his glasses and say, "Son, you worry about yourself. We can manage just fine. I see you couldn't sleep either." LaRouche jerked at the interruption to his thoughts and looked up from the fire to find Father Jim standing there beside him, his arms tight around his chest, and the hood of both the parka and the sweatshirt he wore underneath, up over his head. LaRouche smiled marginally and looked back into the fire. "I gave up on it about an hour ago. Yeah, I've been lying awake for a while." "What's bothering you?" Father Jim chuckled. "Death, dismemberment, the unknown." LaRouche laughed quietly. "Yeah, that'll keep you up at night." "Let me guess. Big responsibilities and fear of failure." "Swing and miss, Father." LaRouche rose up and stretched his legs. "Well, I'm not a mind reader." Jim held his hands out to the fire. LaRouche let the silence stretch for a minute. "You have family, Jim." "Yes." "Wife, kids?" "No, never married. I've got a mother and father, but they live in upstate New York, so. Oh, I guess I should say lived. Do you know that they're dead? They were pretty old. Still, yeah, maybe. La Rouche eyed the ex-priest. Any thoughts, devotionals, words of wisdom? Jim smiled. How about a verse of the day? Okay, I'm listening. Jim squeezed La Rouche's shoulder and spoke with the quiet confidence of a clergyman. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who believe and are saved. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. La Rouche considered the words for a time. How do you keep all of those scriptures in your head? Jim laughed. Oh, I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible, unfortunately. I know that doesn't make me a very good priest, but then again, I never pretended to be a very good priest. He sighed. No. The scriptures that I'm able to quote directly are only because I've quoted them to myself every day since this all began, trying to remind myself that I'm gonna get through this. You have doubts. I always have doubts. It's human nature to doubt. But faith isn't the absence of doubt. It's the decision to believe in something contrary to what you observe. So you believe that we'll come out of this okay. A faint smile. I've made the decision to believe that there is a purpose to all of this, that everything works together for the glory of God, and that whether or not my own personal survival is in the cards, what we're doing here needs to be done, and will be done. What if the purpose is to wipe out the human race? Jim looked at him askew. What if there's no God? La Rouche seemed taken aback by the suggestion. You can gloom and doom it all day long, and I guarantee you won't beat me at it. My family's Irish Catholic. La Rouche chuffed and rolled his eyes. Positive thinking to us is expecting the worst and hoping it's over quickly. Okay, La Rouche laughed. You've got me beat. Hopefully you've learned your lesson. Jim adjusted his glasses and spoke sternly. Don't ever try to one-up me on depressing thoughts, ever again. So, you're ready for this? Jim thought about it. I suppose so, you. Yeah, I suppose so as well. Chapter 27, Traders. Marie made a special breakfast that morning. She began cooking when it was still dark and continued on until everyone had eaten. She viewed it as her job to keep everyone fed, and with the two groups due to depart later that day, she felt that it was her duty to cook an extravagant breakfast, or at least what passed for extravagant at Camp Ryder. It became apparent as she cooked that she'd been hiding away stashes of goods a little bit at a time. Things that she normally didn't use in the regular cooking. Things like sugar and cinnamon, things that were hard to come by. So Camp Ryder and its members that had volunteered to go out to the east and to the north, to blow bridges and rescue refugees, felt like kings at breakfast, and full of good food and lifted by the light-hearted conversation that went with it. They left to gather their things and say their goodbyes. Lee Harper and La Rouche began to arrange the vehicles into two columns and to load the LMTVs with their respective payloads of ordnance and munitions, as well as stocking the Humvees with extra ammunition, food, and water. After a while, they were joined by Wilson and Lucky, who helped load in the last couple 100 pounds of C4 and several crates of Claymore mines. As they worked, the day began to warm slightly, and they even began to sweat, though it was quickly chilled from their foreheads once they stood still for a moment. The jackets came off, and they worked in just their hoodies and sweaters. Gradually, the vehicles were filled to capacity, and the volunteers began to trickle into the square, stowing their packs in the rears of the vehicles they would ride in or drive. As the work became lighter, and more of them stood around in quiet conversation, the jackets were donned again. When they were finished, Lee met Harper and LaRouche between the two columns of vehicles. He'd left Tomlin upstairs in the office to avoid having to explain things repeatedly. Bus was aware of the situation, and Lee was sure that everyone in Camp Ryder would hear it from the good old-fashioned grapevine soon enough. He put a hand on each of their shoulders. "You guys feeling okay about this?" "Yes." "Sure," LaRouche nodded. "I guess," Harper said, a little less confident. "I have to work with Tomlin to resolve a couple issues," Lee continued quietly. "As soon as I can make sure everything is secure back here, I'll be joining you, LaRouche, out east. You both have a half-dozen repeaters in your supplies, so make 'em count and stay in contact so we can coordinate okay." "Roger that," LaRouche sighed. "How long do you think you'll be?" "No idea," Lee shrugged. "I'll ballpark it at a week." Harper looked at him gravely. "Just be careful, Lee." Lee smiled. "I'm always careful." "Okay." Lee took his hands from their shoulders. "Take it to guys." Without another word, they mounted up, and a chorus of diesel engines rumbled to life up and down the columns of vehicles. Lee stood in the middle of them and crossed his arms over his chest, feeling sick to his stomach. If there was anything more nerve-wracking than being in danger, it was sending others out to be in danger without you. The sentries pulled the front gates clear of the road. In the side view mirror of the lead Humvee, Lee could see Harper looking at him. His face was pure concern, but when Lee made eye contact with him, he smiled bravely and flicked a salute off his forehead. Lee returned the gesture, and the Humvee rolled away. Harper's convoy left first, followed immediately by LaRouche's. The long train of vehicles kicked up dust as they trundled out of Camp Ryder, slowly and deliberately out into a hostile world, and in less than an hour they would be in unknown territory amongst unknown threats and unknown people. They would adapt and overcome. They would have to. Everything depended on it. Out of sight from Camp Ryder, down the winding dirt road that led away from safety and security, Harper's lead Humvee reached the end of the dirt road and the beginning of the blacktop of Highway 27. The column slowed to a stop as though waiting for a break in traffic before continuing. Then the Humvee's tires scratched over the gravel, turning right, towards Highway 421 that would take them north, towards their destination. The column of vehicles split in the middle, half going right and half going left. Jerry leaned against a shanty, quietly regarding the gates as the convoy of military vehicles disappeared from sight. His lips were pursed in concentration, and his mind was working quickly now, his heart beating fast in his chest as he thought about his plan. Camp Ryder was empty of Captain Hardin's thugs. All the volunteers that had any training had just left in a cloud of dust. His fingers and toes tingled with excitement. The gates were closed and locked again, and Bus and Captain Hardin, walking side by side, disappeared back into the Camp Ryder building. Something was going on between them and whoever the guy was that they'd captured yesterday. Eyes and ears around the camp were telling Jerry that the captive was no longer so captive, and possibly was up in the office with Bus and Captain Hardin. Interesting. Jerry turned quickly and strode through the rows of shacks towards the fence line. When he reached it, he hung a left and followed the chain-link fence all the way to the quiet northwestern corner of the compound, where a jumble of shipping containers had yet to be put to good use, and no shanties had been built. He sidled between two shipping containers and found Greg waiting. "What's the news?" Greg looked around conspiratorially. "Just got word from Doc Hamilton in Smithfield. Apparently that guy from Virginia." "Jacob." "Yeah, apparently he shows up last night with a package." Greg's voice dropped even lower and he leaned forward. It was an infected. They captured an infected. Jerry's face screwed up. What? Why the hell would they do that? Greg shook his head. That's not all, man. Doc Hamilton says that Jacob had him help with the infected. They have it secured in a room so that Jacob can study it, but here's what really freaked me out. Greg swallowed. The infected is a female, and she's pregnant. The two men stared at each other. You're sure about this? Greg shrugged. I haven't seen it. I'm just relaying what Doc Hamilton told me. And Doc Hamilton was freaked out by this shit. If you're asking my opinion, then yes, I believe it's true. Jerry rubbed his stubbled chin. This changes things. They're procreating. They're not dying off. Jerry looked at his compatriot. No, they're not. I don't think it would be wise to wait until the refugees from up north get here to make our move. This is something we need to get ahead of immediately. We need to move now. Jerry nodded. Send the message to Professor White to be ready to move. The minute he gets his weapons, I want him staging right outside Camp Ryder, out of sight. You know the plan. Greg nodded. I'll take care of it. Jerry turned to leave, but then stopped himself. Greg. Greg raised an eyebrow. Jerry wagged a finger. Don't tell him about the pregnant infected. Lie to him if you have to, but he cannot know about that. Greg looked like he didn't quite understand, but nodded anyways. Jerry slipped quietly out from between the shipping containers. There was work to be done. Let's talk about this informant, Lee said, taking a seat in the office. Tomlin was center stage between Lee and Bus, his hands clutched in his lap, the subject of Bus's intense scrutiny. The bigger man sat leaning forward and glaring unsurely at the newcomer from underneath bushy brows. Lee had explained the situation in short form, and to his credit, Bus simply absorbed the information without reaction. Tomlin nodded to the question. Okay, but I should be clear, I don't know the guy. You knew the two marksmen, Lee pointed out. Didn't you? Would you know of anyone else he might send? First, I didn't know the two marksmen. Tomlin met their eyes. I found out about them after they'd already been sent, but I couldn't have picked them out of a crowd, and I have no idea who they would have sent to do this job. He shrugged. I can make some educated assumptions, though. Such as? He directed his attention to Bus. How many people does Camp Ryder take in, let's say, on a weekly basis? Bus, still showing some hesitance, glanced at Lee, who nodded. Bus didn't seem to want to give Tomlin extra information, but if Lee trusted him. Maybe 3 or 4 a week, usually families or groups. I don't think it's going to be hard to find this person. Tomlin unfolded his arms and looked a bit more confident. They would have come within the last month, so you're talking about a maximum of maybe a dozen potential suspects. I think we can narrow it down from there. I imagine he would have come alone, Lee suggested. Bus grimaced. I don't know if we've had any single folks come in lately except maybe Jacob. Jacob, the guy from Virginia? Tomlin asked. Yes. Tomlin shook his head but didn't look very sure of himself. I don't know. He came straight from Mitchell. I guess it's possible. Bus made a grim noise. If it's possible, we should pursue it. Lee rubbed his neck. No one else has shown up by themselves. Bus thought about it for a moment, mentally flipping the pages of an imaginary ledger. Finally, he shook his head. No, and I personally oversee everyone that comes into Camp Ryder. What about groups? Lee said. He might have inserted himself into another group that was traveling. That would help hide him, Tomlin agreed. Most of the groups we get are families. Bus tapped a finger. But we've gotten 2 groups of 3 in the past month that have not been related to each other. One was two men and a woman, and the other was three guys, a little younger, like maybe fresh out of college. Now Tomlin leaned forward, interested. The younger guys, anyone in the group stand out? Anyone strike you as military? Or maybe the other two didn't seem as comfortable with him? Bus shook his head. No, there was nothing really noteworthy about them. But they did get here at the beginning of last month, maybe the first week of October. Is that too early? Tomlin wavered a hand. It's a bit early, but not out of the question. Let me ask you a question, Brian. Lee steepled his fingers. You told me earlier that you were basically concerned for my safety. Whoever this guy is he going to try to take me out? Lee, Tomlin seemed uncomfortable. I don't know. I don't know how he's communicating with Abe or any of that other shit. But I can tell you that eventually the powers that be will realize I'm no longer working for them if they have not realized that already. And when they realize that I'm out of the equation and the two marksmen have been killed, the only person they have left to take you out is whoever snuck into Camp Ryder. Tomlin rubbed his legs. And they want you dead, Lee. Lee sat still for a moment. He took a heavy breath and puffed it out. Okay. Then here's what I propose. I've got to run a batch of rifles out to Professor White's group at Lillington ASAP. While I'm doing that, you two work together to make a list of potential suspects. Then we'll question our potentials and hopefully root out the one we're looking for. Bus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Tomlin nodded slowly. Lee eyed them. Problem with the plan. Those are heavy charges to bring on someone, Bus said quietly. Brian's a good interrogator, Lee gestured towards his fellow captain. He knows how to read people, and he'll know when they're lying to him. We won't need to make any accusations. We'll keep things as friendly as possible. But we can't just sit around and wait for them to reveal themselves, Bus. We're going to have to go in and pull them out. Bus changed the subject. You're not making the trip out to Lillington by yourself, are you? Well, I figured I'd grab Eddie Ramirez and see if we couldn't swing by and take a look at some of those vehicles we left behind. Figure out what he needs to fix to M. You sure you don't want me to come with you? Tomlin asked. No, Lee shook his head. I want you here with Bus, figuring out who we need to talk to. I've got to ask, Bus turned to Lee. What are we gonna do when we find this person? Lee rubbed his hands together and inspected the ground at his feet. I dunno. We'll just have to cross that bridge when we come to it, Bus. When he looked up, he found Tomlin looking at him with peculiar intensity. The look conveyed everything that Lee did not want to say, did not want to put into words, because it was nasty and divisive and would ruin relationships with the people of Camp Ryder. Lee gave Tomlin an almost imperceptible nod. Yeah, I know, he thought. It's gonna be ugly. When Lee left the office, there was a long moment of awkward silence between Tomlin and Bus, the two men sitting across from each other, each sizing the other up. Out of deference to the man that apparently ran Camp Ryder, Tomlin kept his mouth shut and waited for Bus to say something. However, it became apparent after an unsettling 60 seconds that Bus had no intention of being the first to break the silence. Tomlin smacked his lips. All right, I'll go first. Bus cleared his throat and tilted his head back slightly. I think it's pretty clear that you don't like me. I would say that I'm. Bus tried a few different words in his mind before settling on one. Ambivalent. Tomlin gave him a long-suffering smile. Ambivalent. Yes. Fair enough. Let's start this relationship out with some honesty. Honesty sounds great. There's someone in your camp that is going to try to kill Captain Hardin. We're not going to let that happen, because if it were to happen, there would be dire consequences for both of us. Aside from the fact that neither of us want to see him hurt because he's our friend, we're gonna have a hell of a time fighting this battle without him. Bus nodded once. If you agree with that, then I'll make you a deal. I help you find this guy and I won't poke my nose in any other place it doesn't need to be, as long as I get the information I need, and I come up with a list of suspects, question them, and figure out who the bad guy is. And in return for that, you trust me. Captain Tomlin, Bus sighed. Trust, much like respect, is something you have to earn. It is not freely given. And what would earn your trust? Bus took a moment and realized where Tomlin was going with this. It was a good move, come up with the terms, and then make it sound like they were Bus's idea. But in reality, what other terms were there? What else could he ask Tomlin to do that would earn his trust? In the end, it all came back to the same answer. Help me find this guy. Bus smiled without humor, and we'll see where you stand after that. Tomlin grinned, causing the scars on his scalp to shift. He extended his hand. Sounds like a deal. Begrudgingly, Bus reached out and shook the man's hand. There was something uniquely disquieting about having someone who wanted to kill you, Lee discovered. Feeling both heavy and jumpy at the same time, Lee exited the Camp Ryder building into what was turning into a bright, cloudless fall day. A day that would have made him want to throw a pack together and take a trip up to the mountains in better times. Now he stood on the steps, feeling slightly sickened, and looked out at the people of Camp Ryder, bustling about their chores, gathering water, splitting wood, preparing for scavenging trips outside the wire. Everyone seemed suspicious. They all moved too purposefully for Lee, as though they were trying too hard to be nonchalant. He felt eyes on him, and when he looked they smiled fake smiles with hidden meanings, and he could not force himself to smile back. A grumble next to his side drew his attention back. He looked down and found Deuce standing close, but not too close, to his side, and gazing up at Lee with hopeful eyes and a tail that wagged hesitantly. He tried to get the mutt to come inside with him, but Deuce wasn't keen on the Camp Ryder building and chose instead to lurk around the corner from the front door and mumble at passers-by, as suspicious with everyone as Lee had just become. "Hey, boy," Lee murmured. "You hungry?" The dog bobbed his head as though he were nodding in response. "Course you are." Lee had already brought the dog a hefty plateful of scraps after breakfast, but dogs were always hungry, it seemed. "How about a ride? You want to go for a ride?" The dog tilted its head. Lee smiled and started down the steps. "Come on." The dog followed. Lee was under no illusions that Deuce was obedient, but more so that Lee was the only one that brought him food, so naturally he tagged along, hoping for more. But that was where obedience began with dogs. Good old Pavlovian training. He found Eddie Ramirez walking across the square, away from the front gates. Lee called out after him and he turned and waved with a half-smile. "Hey, Captain, what's up?" "Got plans for the day?" Lee asked, shaking the man's hand. Eddie looked back towards the gate. "Actually, I was just about to go out with a scavenging crew, see if I couldn't rustle up some car parts, try to earn my keep a little." Lee nodded. "I'd like to borrow you if you can rain check them." Eddie looked down at Deuce, who took up a position to Lee's right. Yeah, I guess. What do you need?" "I've got to run some rifles and ammo down to Lillington. I need a second to ride with me, and I figured we could drive up and take a look at some of those vehicles we had to leave at the airport. Maybe you can figure out what you need to fix them." Eddie nodded. "Yeah, absolutely. You know where we keep all the rifles and ammunition?" Eddie pointed to a shipping container between the front gate and the Camp Ryder building. "I'm assuming that one that you got everything out of earlier today." Yup, I'm gonna pull the Humvee around so we can load up. All the gun truck Humvees had been taken by Harper and LaRouche's groups, which left them only with the cargo variant they'd retrieved from the airport the day before. It was equipped with a radio, but no turret. That was fine. If they got into any trouble, they'd ditch whatever they were doing and hightail it, rather than fight it out. It was not infected that Lee was truly concerned with. They could be outrun in a vehicle. It was hostile people with guns that worried him. But the patrols out of Outpost Lillington were now including the roads to Broadway and a few miles past, and they had not reported anything. Lee backed the cargo Humvee up to the shipping container. It was close to the front gate, so that the sentries could keep an eye on it during their normal duties. As he opened it up, Deuce lingered around the Humvee and took a piss on one of the tires. The shipping container was mostly empty, save for a dozen rifles and a few thousand rounds. Everything else had gone with the two groups to help them bargain with and recruit other groups of survivors to join the fight. What was left would go to Lillington and Professor White's group. Lee didn't like having an empty gun locker, but there were more rifles and ammunition at Bunker 8. Perhaps he would make another trip out there before he left to catch up with LaRouche's group. "Anyone give you a rifle yet?" Lee asked of Eddie. He shook his head, looking a little dubious of the little black M4. No, didn't realize. That was the welcoming gift. Lee smiled. Yeah, no fruit baskets here, just an M4 and a couple hundred rounds. He took one of the rifles and one of the shoulder sling magazine pouches and handed them to Eddie. "You ever use one before?" "UHNO, can't say that I have." Lee gave him a 2-minute crash course on the operation of the weapon. Eddie nodded along, his eyes intense and never leaving the rifle, as though it might jump and bite him if he handled it incorrectly. Lee wasn't sure how good Eddie would be with the thing, but he still wanted his passenger to be armed. When Lee felt that Eddie had a good enough grasp of how to use the rifle, they loaded the rest into the cargo bed of the Humvee and piled in, Deuce taking a watchful position in the back with the goods. They got their armbands from the sentries at the front gate, blue, today, and then they left Camp Ryder. As they drove down the dirt road, Eddie nervously clutched his new weapon and stared at the front gate as it retreated in the side view mirror. Chapter 28, Tipping Point. They reached Lillington at noon. Over the course of the last week, Professor White's group from Fuquay-Varina and Old Man Hughes' group from Dunn had built the outpost into a defensible location. The wide entrance to the south was blocked with a clutter of dumpsters and concertina wire. The western entrance was manned by a sentry at all times, and there was another that roamed the rooftops, looking out for signs of trouble from infected or human threats. As they neared the compound, the sentry atop the roof waved to them, and they slowed. Lee dropped his window and hung his left arm out, displaying the blue armband they'd affixed when they left Camp Ryder. The sentry took a good look at them, and Lee recognized him as one of the guys from Old Man Hughes' group. When the sentry was satisfied, he waved them on and they pulled around the corner into the eastern entrance where the second sentry, a middle-aged woman with auburn hair, was in the process of removing the white car from where it blocked the narrow alley. Lee nodded to her and she smiled and motioned them through. "Hey, Captain," she said as they pulled abreast of her. "We've been expecting you." She leaned on Lee's door and her face became grave. After what happened with Professor White's group, he's been pretty panicked to get his hands on some rifles. Lee nodded impassively. "I guess he should have taken them when I first offered them." She shrugged. "Maybe he won't give you so much grief now." "Maybe, but I wouldn't count on it." She cracked a smile again and allowed them to pass through. They were met in the parking lot by the younger man with blonde dreadlocks sticking out of a black watch cap. He regarded them coolly as they stepped out of the Humvee. He offered no greeting to Lee and kept his arms crossed defensively over his chest. "Did you bring the rifles?" Lee gave him a look that he hoped communicated how stupid the question was. Then he pointed to the cargo bed in the back of the Humvee, where all the black rifles and green cans of ammunition were stacked, plainly visible. Deuce maintained his spot in the bed and looked curiously between the two men, as though he found their quiet animosity fascinating. Dreadlocks kept his haughty stare up for a moment more before following where Lee pointed and seeing the weapons in the back of the truck. He nodded. "For the record, I don't agree with this." Lee closed his door behind him. "Where's White?" "Busy." Figures, Lee thought. He wouldn't have the balls to face me. "Okay," Lee said. "You want to call your people out here so I can hand the rifles out. You can just drop them here." Dreadlocks put one hand on his hip and pointed to the ground at his feet with the other, like he was some factory foreman commanding a workforce. "I'll distribute them." Lee's expression remained impassive. "Or you can call your people out here so I can hand the rifles out and explain how they work." He touched his chin. "Unless you have some extensive firearms experience I don't know about." Dreadlocks rolled his eyes. "Fine." He retreated quickly and disappeared into one of the buildings. Eddie had crossed over to Lee's side of the vehicle and was leaning against the cargo bed, shaking his head. "Damn, they really like you." Lee smiled. "That's my fan club." It took a few minutes for Dreadlocks to corral his people into a loose bunch at the side of Lee's Humvee. When he had their attention, Lee spoke slowly and clearly, going over the basics of the weapon system he was about to hand out. He explained how to load the weapon, how to aim and fire, how to change magazines, and how to tap rack ready if they experienced a jam. Lastly, he went over how to disassemble, clean, and reassemble the rifle. To their credit, though a few appeared to have the same attitude as Dreadlocks, most of them listened attentively and seemed to be absorbing the information. It took nearly a half an hour to explain and issue everyone a weapon and 6 magazines in a shoulder sling. They had no questions for him, and they all took their rifles and filed silently away. Lee watched them go, feeling less than enthused about handing out weapons to this group. If he was going to hand them out, he preferred it be to people that would actually help when shit hit the fan. With these people, only God knew what they would do when the bad times came. Just toting a rifle didn't make you a badass. It took a certain mental edge for a person to put a rifle to good use, and looking at their eyes, their faces, the entire way that they carried themselves, Lee just didn't see it. But who knows, right? I've been wrong about people before. He turned and opened the door to the Humvee. "Come on, let's get the fuck out of here." The waiting was unbearable. Jerry sat in his shanty, going over everything in his mind, picturing all the outcomes like a chess player anticipates the movements of the board several steps ahead. His whole body was jittery at the thought of it, alive with tension. He found his hands becoming increasingly clammy. They were ice cold, but somehow the palms would not stop sweating. He'd urinated 3 times within the last hour. Noon came and went, and he couldn't find the appetite to eat anything for lunch. He laid down on his mattress and stared at the ceiling, but the recumbent position was too much for him to hold. He had to be up, he had to move, but he feared stepping out of his shanty. He felt his plan like a bright, neon billboard strapped around his chest, and anyone he came into contact with would know. They would know, and then they would blow the whole damn thing. He jumped off of his mattress and paced the tiny confines of his room. Fuck, what time was it? He checked his watch and discovered only 3 minutes had passed since he'd last checked. Jerry darted to his door and opened it a crack. If he craned his neck out just right, he could see the square and the front gate. The sentry stood, idle at his post, his rifle slung on his back, his face relaxed. Still no sign of Greg. Jesus Christ, Jerry whispered to himself. Where was that bastard? He closed his door and set to pacing the room again. He could feel his bladder spasming. He tried to ignore it, shuffling around his room like a child on the verge of wetting his pants during a game of hide-and-go-seek. The sensation persisted and finally won out. Jerry snatched up a gallon jug that sloshed at the bottom with a murky, yellow-tinted fluid. He pulled himself out of his pants and stuck the head of his penis in the top of the jug. A weak stream dribbled forth for all of 5 seconds. He swore and put himself away. It would all be worth it. It would all be worth it to see the look on Bus's face. And Lee, Jerry thought, baring his teeth. Fucking G.I. Joe himself. He straightened suddenly, tilting his head. Was that the sound of the gate opening? Jerry rushed to his door again, pushing it open a little farther this time and sticking his head out. His heart leaped as he saw that the gate was indeed drawing open. On the other side, waiting patiently for the path to clear, was Greg's old gray Geo. What would Greg say? Was it time? Was everything in place? Or was it bad news? Did something go wrong? There were so many things that could go wrong. He closed his door and put his back to it, only to realize that he needed to exit his shanty. He pushed through the door, forcing the unbearable nervousness to shed off of him, as though he were shucking off a clingy robe. He took a deep breath as he left the safety of his little shack and walked with as much confidence as he could muster, raising his chin and relaxing his face into the barely visible smirk that he usually wore. The look of someone that is always supremely pleased with himself. Ahead of him, the tiny gray SUV pulled through the gate, and the sentry closed it back. The Geo whirled around, kicking up a tiny amount of dust, and parked in the same spot that Greg always parked in to open the tailgate and barter with whatever items he'd scavenged. There would be no bartering today, which was no loss. The little trade market was slower than usual today, and only a few people were hanging out with anything to offer, and only one person had come in from Broadway to scout around for some mechanical parts. Greg stepped out of his vehicle, and his eyes went immediately to Jerry, who was just now emerging from the rows of shanties. His eyes were clouded and serious, and he gave the slightest of nods, an affirmation that made Jerry's pulse quick step. Jerry motioned to the right with a subtle gesture of his head, and the two parties converged in the center of the square and began walking towards the northeastern corner. "They're on the way," Greg said. "What's their ETA?" "They were a few minutes behind me. Might already be in place." "And you explained everything?" "The signal and what I want them to do." "Yes." "Good." Jerry felt almost lightheaded. They passed the last row of shanties and looked around cautiously to see if they were being observed by anyone. When it appeared that they were not, they walked quickly to the collection of unused shipping containers. This time, rather than squeezing into the hollow space between them, they approached the doors to one, and Greg quickly knocked twice, then twice again. Then he pulled one of the doors open, and he and Jerry slipped quickly inside. The interior was dimly lit by a kerosene lantern, dangling from a hook in the roof of the container. Lined up along each wall were 10 men. They all held the M4 rifles and the shoulder-sling magazine pouches that Lee had given them. There was something vicious and ironic about that, but Jerry supposed it was not the first time someone from the U.S. government had handed out weapons like candy, and it had backfired on them. The U.S. had always been far too trusting. Captain Hardin had always been far too trusting. Hubris or stupidity, Jerry wasn't sure. All of that changed today. The world was a harsh, cold, cruel place, and people outside these walls were not their friends. They were only drains on their resources that would cut and run as soon as being a community became inconvenient for them. Jerry recognized that this was how the world worked. This was how the world had always worked, and anyone who put their best foot forward was only looking to get it lopped off. You had to close yourself off, wall yourself in, cut out the rest of the world. That was how it had always been, and nothing had changed with the collapse of society except for the apparent nature of it. Any society that opened its doors would sooner or later be destroyed. A closed society might not be a rich society, but they were a safe society. But it took strength and purpose and perseverance to maintain that safe society. Bus was unwilling to turn anyone away because he was an incapable leader, and as a result, they had become weak. They had recreated the very same weaknesses that had doomed the United States to begin with. This time around, things would be different, because Jerry was going to lead this community, and he was going to correct their course. He was going to set a path for them that was sustainable, and promised that they would survive, and not simply starve to death a year down the road, happy that they had a clear conscience because they'd allowed any person with a sob story to come into their gates and suck down their resources. Jerry smiled at the men before him. "Gentlemen, our future begins today." Solemnly, they nodded their heads. Their lips were bloodless lines on their faces, their jaws struck hard from stone, their eyes cold and ready. "Arnie will take the post at the front gate any minute, and then me and Greg will move in." Jerry pointed back behind him. "The rest of you wait until you hear the signal before you move. You know what to do from there." Jerry smiled confidently. "This is our time. We've got one golden opportunity to take back Camp Ryder. Let's do it right." One of the men stepped forward slightly. "We're ready, Jerry." Jerry turned to Greg. "Do you have the flare gun?" Greg patted his cargo pocket. "Ready to go." "Good." Jerry took a deep breath. "Any minute now." Arnie Brewer hitched his baggy pants up over the loose skin of his gut that used to hold the substantial potbelly that he could have rested a beer can on while he watched TV. Now his midsection was floppy and weird, all the fat sucked out of it, but the skin still there, hanging off of him like a deflated balloon. He had to position the waistband of his pants in the right spot, slightly low on his hips, so that it pinned the folds of loose skin to his crotch. Otherwise, if he ran, it would constantly flail around and smack him repeatedly in his groin. Very uncomfortable. With his gut sack securely pinned to his nut sack, he hitched the rifle up on his shoulder and approached the front gate where the younger, bright-eyed kid, Jamie Bechtold, stood watch. Arnie smiled and waved as he approached. "What's up, Jamie?" The younger man waved back. "Fucking starvin'." "Sorry, man." Arnie took a spot to the side of the gate. "Had some shit to take care of. Go get yourself something to eat. I got this." Jamie stretched tiredly. "All right, bro, appreciate it." Arnie watched the kid work some life back into his legs as he sauntered away, taking entirely too long to disappear. He looked around. The square was almost empty. Only one or two people, standing around, shooting the shit with each other. There wasn't much trading going on today, and most people were either out scavenging or they were taking a break for lunch. Arnie's gaze broke off from the square, and he looked through the wide dirt space that cut through the shanty town. At the end of it, in the northeastern corner, he could see the shipping containers that had stood there in the same position since he'd arrived at Camp Ryder. The doors of a single container faced him, and one of them hung slightly open. The darkness inside created a black frame around the door. A tiny half-moon face peered out at him, pale and stark in the space. His mouth dry and gritty, Arnie shifted his feet and sidled his belt around his midsection again. Then he stared right at the face and he nodded just once. 100 yards away in the quiet darkness of the shipping container, Jerry saw the signal. He turned to Greg. "That's us. We're on." He reached inside his jacket and felt the sawed-off shotgun slung at his side, felt the rough wood grip of it, and took confidence from it. Moving with as much restraint as they could muster, trying desperately to look casual, Greg and Jerry slipped out of the shipping container and began making their way towards the Camp Ryder building. Angela made her way across the square, towards the last row of shanties. She moved with purpose and carried a satchel slung onto her arm and 2 blankets over her shoulder. As she made her way towards the last row, Jerry and one of his friends passed by. They both looked very serious and intently busy, but when they saw her, they smiled. Snakes in the grass, she thought to herself, but nodded and smiled politely to them. She did not like Jerry, and it wasn't at all because he had opposed Lee on so many occasions. There were some people that disagreed regularly with how Lee did things, and she'd found them to be great people. She prided herself in being a pretty good judge of character, and Jerry had always struck her as conniving. She didn't trust him one bit. She hung a left at the last row of shanties and walked down to the end, to the brand new shanty that had been erected for the Ramirez family. Vicky Ramirez was standing outside, banging dust and dirt out of a large quilt. She smiled widely when she saw Angela approaching. "Hey, Vicky." "Angela, how are you?" She gestured to the blanket. "Just doing a little cleaning." "Where's Elise and Anton?" "They're on the other side of the complex, playing with the other kids." Vicky balled the quilt up in her arms and stepped through the doorway to her shanty. "Come on in." The 2 women ducked through the low entrance. The roof was just a tarp draped over a simple A-frame to allow rain to slide off, rather than gathering in the middle and eventually collapsing on the family while they slept. Vicky had pulled the tarp back so that the daylight illuminated their little living area. Angela laid the blankets and satchel down on the floor. "How are you guys acclimating?" "Oh, you know." Vicky's smile had a sadness to it. "Doing the best we can." Angela touched her arm comfortingly. "I understand. I felt the same way when I first got here. I know it's tough starting out, but these are all great people." Vicky nodded. "Yes, we appreciate everything." Angela clapped her hands. "Hey, I brought you the extra blankets you asked for." She bent down and picked the 2 blankets up, passing them over to Vicky. Vicky took the blankets, looking truly grateful. "Thank you so much for that." "Well, it's been cold." Angela smiled. "And I know how it is to take care of little ones." She opened up the satchel on the floor, revealing a collection of canned goods and a bag of beans. "Me and a few of the others put together a little care package. I know it's not much, but it'll hopefully give you guys a 3rd meal between breakfast and dinner, at least until you guys can get on your feet." Vicky gazed down at the goods before her, clutching the 2 blankets tight to her chest. Her face tightened and her lower lip trembled just slightly. She looked as though she were on the verge of an outbreak of emotions, but she took a breath and nodded. "Thank you. You didn't have to be so generous." Angela smiled welcomingly and waved her off. "It's the least we could do." "I mean, your husband is out helping Captain Hardin right now. We should at least take care of his family." When she said this, Vicky's face did something different. The eyes averted down and to the right, blinking rapidly as her hand came up and touched her lips. It seemed as though she realized that her strange reaction was apparent, and she turned herself away from Angela, as if to hide. She busied herself with straightening the folds of the blanket and placing them on the bed. Angela studied the other woman for a moment, then clasped her hands in front of her. "Listen, Vicky, is everything okay?" "Yes." Vicky faced her quickly, and Angela could see shame etched on her features and the beginnings of tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes, everything's fine." Angela took a step forward and raised her eyebrows, an expression that clearly communicated that she was not buying it. "Vicky." The other woman's shoulders slumped and she turned, looking at the ground, still covering her face with her hand. When she spoke, her voice shook and cracked. "It's just that you and the others have been so kind, and we've all." Her eyes raised up to Angela's and she seemed to draw herself up. "I have to tell you something, before something bad happens." Chapter 29. Bad Things. La Rouche stood at the hood of the Humvee, feeling the engine hot underneath the paper map laid out across the hood, the steady rumbling of it vibrating the pen in his hand. He turned and, keeping one hand on the map to pin it to the hood, shielded his eyes from the sun with his other hand, and looked up at the water tower perhaps 100 yards off to his left. The convoy sat idling along a straight and barren stretch of road known as Memorial Church Road. Ahead of them, the intersection of Highway 581 cut across their path, surrounded by wilted and brown remnants of crops, corn on the right, and what appeared to be beets on the left. At the base of the water tower, Jim and Wilson stood with their rifles to their shoulders, carefully scanning the surrounding fields and woods for any sign of danger. Halfway up the ladder that rose along one of the tower's legs, Lucky climbed, trailing a pack that contained another repeater set. They were slightly less than 30 miles east of Smithfield. As he watched, Lucky reached the top and scrambled onto the catwalk to post the digital repeater. La Rouche looked back to his map and used his pen to mark the intersection with a big black dot. If they ever needed to do repairs, they would know where the repeaters were posted. After making the dot, he traced his fingers along the line of the road they were on, heading east. They were a short distance from the town of Fremont, and La Rouche immediately began to look for the best route to skirt around it. A whistle drew his attention to the water tower. Lucky was clattering down the ladder at an unusually fast pace. On the ground, Jim and Wilson had their rifles at the ready and were scanning out to the east. "Shit." La Rouche banged on the hood and hurriedly folded the map. "Heads up, everyone," he yelled out to the other vehicles. "Cover the road to the east. I think we got company." La Rouche shoved the crumpled map into his jacket and shuffled around the Humvee to the passenger's side. Jim, Wilson, and Lucky were sprinting across the gravel lot between the road and the water tower. Lucky was waving his hands wildly while his rifle jittered about on his chest. "Two pickup trucks coming down the road," he yelled as he drew close. "How far out?" "Less than a mile." "Eyes on," Jim yelled, turning his body east and bringing his rifle up. Down the road about a half a mile, the lead pickup truck came into view, a late model, small-sized pickup, burgundy in color. Following close behind it was another pickup, this one larger and newer. La Rouche could immediately see that there were people in the beds of the pickup trucks, but he couldn't tell if they were armed or not. "Wilson, get on the 50. La Rouche turned and faced the rest of the convoy, stepping out from the column so that everyone could see and hear him. He held up his hand. "Everyone hold your fire." "They saw us," Lucky called out. When La Rouche turned, the vehicles were halted in the road like two deer caught in a spotlight. They sat abreast of each other as though their drivers were conferring about whether or not to proceed. La Rouche made himself small up against the side of the Humvee, rifle addressed towards the two unknown vehicles. "Should we signal that it's okay?" Jim asked. "No, fuck 'em," La Rouche snapped. "We're not here to make friends. That's the captain's job. The sooner they move on, the better." Jim shrugged. "Your call." "My call is fuck 'em," La Rouche repeated. The better part of a very long minute passed them in silence. For some inexplicable reason, the two pickup trucks then began to roll slowly toward them, creeping on as though their speed had something to do with their visibility. Perhaps it was a lack of common sense that told them to keep rolling towards the convoy of vehicles with guns pointed at them. Or perhaps it was the exact opposite. Maybe the fact that they had not immediately fired upon them when they clearly had more than enough firepower to do so had convinced this mysterious third party that it was safe to proceed. "Here they come," Wilson called out from the turret. "Keep your gun on them." LaRouche bit his lip. "I'm gonna step out there. They do anything fishy whatsoever, please, please, light them the fuck up for me." Rogerat. Wilson tracked the two pickups with the M2. LaRouche swore and stood up, still holding his rifle in tight, but taking his left hand off the foregrip and raising it high over his head, palm out. The vehicles were 100 yards out and closing steadily, probably going less than 10 miles an hour. He could see that the windows were rolled down and he called out to them. "Hold up. Yeah, stop right there." The lead pickup obediently lurched to a stop in the roadway. LaRouche lowered his rifle, but only slightly. As quickly as his eyes could work, he traced them over everything that he could see in the windows, in the beds of the trucks, but the only thing he could see were weary faces, all of them fearful, grimy, and smudged with what appeared to be soot. Many of them were young, kids maybe 10 or 12 years of age. Even the adults were young, with the exception of the driver of the lead vehicle that looked to be in his mid-40s, and an elderly woman in the bed of one of the pickups that stared blankly on at LaRouche. Seeing this pathetic bunch of refugees, he lowered his rifle just a bit further. LaRouche made eye contact with the driver of the lead vehicle. "Step out of the truck. We're not going to hurt anyone, and we don't want to take anything from you. We just need one of you to hop out and come talk to me." There was a long moment of hesitation, but the middle-aged man in the lead pickup truck finally gave a shrug, resolutely opening his door and stepping out onto the road. His hands were raised, and in his eyes was a look of defeat. "What do you want from us?" LaRouche shook his head. "We don't want anything from you. We want to pass on our way without any trouble, and without you causing us trouble on down the road." The man turned, and for a moment LaRouche thought he was looking back at his people sitting in the pickup trucks. Then LaRouche realized he was looking back down the road, as though picturing whatever he had come from. When he turned back to face LaRouche, he shook his head. "Ain't nothing for us back there." Suspicion squinted LaRouche's eyes. "Where you comin' from?" The man looked grim. "Ain't much left of it now." He pointed back east. "Had a little settlement outside Fremont. Me and a few of the others were in the city, pickin' through the scraps when we saw the smoke. By the time we got back to camp, they'd burned everything to the ground. We picked up the rest of these folks about a mile down the road. They managed to run before the camp got taken over." LaRouche tasted something sour. "Who are you talking about? Who, S?" The man wiped his brow and seemed to just move the soot and dirt around. "I'm guessing it was the followers." LaRouche wanted to roll his eyes, but in the face of this man's tragedy, he thought it would simply be rude. So he restrained his response to a slightly sarcastic, "And what makes you think it was the followers?" "Well," the man put his hands on his hips and spat on the road. "Probably because they hung 10 of our men from crosses." His face twisted just slightly and his eyes blinked quickly. He met LaRouche's gaze, and there was grief but also anger. "See, what they do is use the telephone poles. First they nail M to a 2x4, then they lash that to the telephone pole." The man began to visibly shake, and his words became more strangled. He appeared to be trying to say something else, but couldn't quite do it. He brought a white-knuckled fist to his mouth and breathed ragged, furious breaths for a moment before regaining his composure enough to speak. "I can't tell you the other thing they do. I can't get it out of my mouth. You'll see if you're headed that way." LaRouche found himself staring at the man with his rifle hanging loosely at his side. Cautiously, he pressed forward. The followers are real. Hell, I dunno. The man swiped at his eyes. Whatever the fuck you wanna call 'em, don't matter to me, but we've been hearing the rumors of them from folks traveling out of the coastal region. Thought they was fake. He grew quiet for a moment, then shook his head again. Didn't think they'd come this far west. When did this happen? He raked his dirty hair and rubbed the back of his neck. We saw the smoke about an hour ago. I'm guessing it took some time to do what they did. La Rouche stepped closer to the man and spoke softer. We don't have much to spare for you folks, and I'm sorry for that. But we come from a large community, and it's less than an hour's drive from here. They'll be able to help. The man looked up, dumbfounded. You guys from Camp Ryder? La Rouche drew his head back slightly. Yeah, actually. Are you Captain Hardin? La Rouche was so stunned by the question that he wasn't able to muster an answer for a moment. He almost told the man that he was Captain Hardin, not because he wanted to take credit, but simply because the man's eyes looked so completely hopeful. The look of defeat and desperation had fled from the man's face for that brief moment, and La Rouche didn't want him to be disappointed. But in the end, he shook his head. No, I'm not Captain Hardin. Oh, the man almost looked like he didn't believe him. Do you know him? Is he real? La Rouche smiled. Yeah, he's real. We're actually out here on his orders. The man looked confused. What are you doing? La Rouche shook his head. It's complicated. Look, you're less than 30 miles from Smithfield. They're part of the Camp Ryder hub, so they'll help you out. Go there and tell them Sergeant La Rouche sent you, okay? Okay. Listen, La Rouche took another step forward. Anything you know would be helpful. Up to this point, I've pretty much dismissed the followers as bullshit. If you know what we're heading into. Yeah, the man shoved his hands in his pockets and his shoulders drew up. Everything we've heard has turned out to be true except that, as far as I can tell, they didn't eat nobody. But they did kill most of the men, and several are missing, along with most of the women. The man's chin quivered. They say they take all the girls that are old enough to bear children. They give the males a choice to join them. The ones that don't join willingly are put on the crosses. You know where they went, how many there are. The man shook his head. Went back east, don't know how many there were. They was gone by the time we got back. Had to be at least 50 of them to take over our settlement that quickly. He swallowed hard. We had a lot of people in that camp. His hands searched for something to do as he spoke and eventually just flopped down to his sides like dead meat. This is what they do. They send out raiding parties and they kidnap people, force them to work in the Lord's army. La Rouche absorbed the information. Anything else you can tell me? The man thought for a moment. No, I'm sorry, there's nothing else I can think of. La Rouche nodded. Thank you, please go to Smithfield, they can help you. The man eyed him. You're really from Camp Ryder? Yes, I am. Tell me something about Captain Hardin, so I know you're tellin' the truth. La Rouche almost laughed at the man, but he could see how fragile the courage was in his clouded eyes, and he didn't want it to break. He could have given the man some random factoid about Lee Hardin that might have sufficed for the moment, but he knew the power of rumors and the power of legends, and he knew how they imparted hope and inspiration to the people that heard them, even if sometimes the truth was stretched to its limit. Once, when we were fighting the infected, La Rouche said, I saw him fall down a 3-story elevator shaft. Should have broken every bone in his body after that fall. But you know what the bastard did when I went over to try to wake him up? La Rouche balled his fist. He got up and punched me right in the nose because he thought I was an infected trying to attack him. The man smiled widely. Is that a fact? That's a fact, LaRouche nodded. When you get to Camp Ryder, you watch him walk. He's got a limp in his right leg. That's from his fall down the elevator shaft. All right. The man extended his hand to LaRouche and they shook firmly. I believe you. Go see for yourself. The man stepped back a few paces, then faced eastward, where it seemed that he paused for a half a beat, perhaps struck by the forlorn appearance of his friends and family in their filthy rags and downtrodden faces, or perhaps staring down that stretch of road and picturing the things that lay beyond that cold horizon. Then he continued to his truck. Just as the man reached his truck and opened the driver's door to get in, he stopped and looked back at LaRouche, his face once again grave. You boys be careful if you're headed east. Ain't nothing out there anymore but madmen. All of 'em madmen. LaRouche swallowed. We'll keep that in mind. Best you do, the man said. Best you do. As they left Lillington and drove towards the Sanford airport, Eddie grew more and more quiet. For a while, he held onto his rifle as though it were a blanket, but gradually he released his death grip on it, and now it rested between his legs, leaned forward on the dash. Lee chalked it up to nerves. It was the first time the guy had been out since he got to Camp Ryder, and his last experience hadn't exactly been pleasant. Now Eddie had his left hand planted firmly on his knee and the other hand was inside his jacket pocket, and he looked out the side window at the countryside as it moved by them at a steady clip. He didn't speak, but when Lee took occasional glances at his passenger, he saw the man's jaw bunching quickly. Listen, Lee said. I'm not saying it's going to be clear when we get there, but when we were here yesterday, there were no infected in the area. And if there are any today, we won't stick around. Lee wrangled the steering wheel as he made a right-hand turn. Trust me, I'm not trying to get in a fight today. How far are we away from Lillington? Eddie asked. I dunno, maybe 15 miles. And how far from Camp Ryder? 20 or so. Eddie finally looked away from the window, looking at Lee for a brief moment, and then at the rifle in front of him. Do the patrols come up this way? Yeah, but not often. Lee stretched his neck. They run between settlements mostly, so they'll cover the roads between Lillington and Broadway more than out here. It was an odd question, but he was obviously worried about the dangers of the road. Lee did his best to set his passenger at ease. We haven't seen any raiders in a few weeks. We've done a pretty good job of pushing them out of the region. And as for infected, well, they can't outrun a Humvee. Eddie listened with his eyes closed, nodding. His lips were pressed down and pale. Lee looked at him with a measure of concern. Hey, you all right, man? Eddie's eyes opened. Yes, can we stop? Right here. Yes, stop right here. Is he car sick? Lee thought, having a panic attack maybe. Eddie looked at him, please. Lee let his foot off the accelerator and looked around, checking through the windows and the mirrors and scanning the woods and the fields to the side of the road. Everything was empty and barren, just more anonymous American wasteland. He pressed on the brakes and brought them to a slow stop, straddling the faded, double-yellow line. Lee looked to his right, saw Eddie was staring straight ahead, and followed his gaze out the front windshield. He saw nothing of note. The road led straight forward, the painted lines seeming to draw in on themselves to a single point far down the road. To their right, a barbed wire fence with cedar posts, only a few yards from the shoulder, and beyond that just a rolling set of hills once used to pasture cows. To their left were stands of commercially planted loblolly pines, standing perfectly straight in their distinct rows like soldiers in rank and file. Nothing else. Lee's eyes went back to his passenger. What's up, buddy? You gonna puke or something? Eddie shook his head. I have to tell you something. Lee had been through so much and heard so much, been shocked so many times, that he became surprised at his own surprise sometimes. He swore to himself that he should be immune to the unexpected, but somehow it still had the power to knock him back a few steps. And whenever these revelations came around, they were usually preceded by something along the lines of, "I have to tell you something," or "I have bad news." So Lee mentally hunkered down, determined that he would not let this shock him, not like the news of Abe Daraby's betrayal had shocked him, not like the news of the acting president deciding to leave the East Coast to die had shocked him. He was ready for this one. He lowered his chin as though he were about to take a hard blow. "What is it?" Eddie looked right at him and held his gaze this time. There was regret there and fear. "I think you're a good man, Captain Hardin. I think you're doing the right thing, and you didn't deserve this." Lee's brow wrinkled in confusion. "I'm sorry," Eddie said, and then he pulled a small, silver revolver from his jacket pocket and shot Lee Hardin in the head. Chapter 30, The Coup. Tomlin and Buss were huddled over the desk, poring over a very short list of names and trying to figure out who they were going to speak to first, and how the hell they were going to broach the subject, when Angela burst through the door of the office, holding the hand of Vicky Ramirez. The two men jerked upright when the door came open and stared, wide-eyed at the two women as they stood in the center of the room. The look on Angela's face was one that bordered on panic, and her companion seemed to be resisting slightly as she was pulled forward, her eyes red-rimmed as though she had been crying. "I'm sorry," Vicky protested. "I didn't know, I swear to God." Buss spread his arms out, surprised. Someone mind explaining what's going on?" Angela released her grip on Vicky's hand and stepped forward a bit. "Buss, you need to hear this, and this is Vicky's fault. She said she didn't know, and I believe her. Promise me she won't be punished." Buss was shaking his head rapidly. "I don't even know what you're talking about yet." Angela stomped her foot on the ground. "Promise me." "Jesus," Buss threw his hands up. "Okay, I promise." Tomlin stepped in and spoke in a level voice. "Why don't we calm down, folks?" He turned to Angela. "No one's gonna be punished, but it sounds like pretty sensitive information. Why don't you tell us what we're talking about so we can be on the same page?" Instead of responding to Tomlin, Angela turned her gaze to Vicky and prompted her with a nod of the head. "Tell them what you told me." Vicky's whole body tensed. "I didn't know." Tomlin nodded. "It's okay, we just want to know what's going on." Vicky began to wring her hands. "Well, it's—" Angela reached out to touch her shoulder, offering gentle encouragement. "It's Eddie," Vicky continued. He's not really my husband." Tomlin shot Buss a look. The big bearded man still seemed somewhat bewildered by the suddenness of it all, but he lowered his chin and looked at the dark-haired woman standing across from him. The look on Buss's face was one of intense focus. "What do you mean he's not your husband?" Tears were appearing in Vicky's eyes again. "He's not my husband. I barely even know the guy. He met me and my kids on the road maybe 3 weeks ago." She let out a tiny sob, then covered her mouth with her hand and closed her eyes for a moment. Twin streaks glistened on each of her cheeks. When she opened her eyes again, she seemed slightly more in control. "He said he knew of a place, but we couldn't get in unless we said we were a family. I know it was weird, but we were desperate. We hadn't eaten in days, and we couldn't find any clean water. I don't know anything about surviving. I was a hairdresser before all of this. But he seemed to know what he was doing, and he promised us. He promised us everything would be okay." Tomlin leaned into Buss. 3 weeks is just about the right time frame." Bus stood as still as a stone statue. The only motion was the throbbing of the arteries in his neck. When he spoke, it was like rocks grinding together. What else? Vicky and Angela exchanged a worried look. He's got a phone, it's like a big cell phone, or maybe a radio, Vicky said. He sneaks off in the middle of the night and uses it. I don't know who he's talking to. I know I should have said something, but I just thought it was weird. I didn't think anyone was going to get hurt by it. Tomlin tapped his finger rapidly on the desk top. Fucking satellite phone. That's how he's been staying in contact with Abe. It's gotta be him. Bus nodded. Vicky raised a single finger. There's something else. Bus looked at her. What? I heard one of the old men lost a gun. Vicky couldn't hold Bus's gaze and looked instead at the floor. I don't know much about guns, but I think I saw it in his pack this morning. In Eddie's pack, I mean. It was small and silver, and I don't know if it's the same gun or not, but Eddie never said anything about having a gun before we got here. She shook her head as though she felt foolish. I should have known. Angela stepped to the desk. I think Lee's in danger. Bus immediately whirled to the radio and snatched up the handset. It's him. Eddie's the guy we're looking for. He keyed the mic. Camp Ryder to Captain Hardin, this is Bus Lee. Can you copy me? Static, unending, and emotionless. Bus huffed into the handset. Lee, this is Bus. Answer the fucking radio. This is Bus. Behind him, Bus could hear Vicky murmuring, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Can anyone copy my radio? Bus held the PTT button down so hard he thought he might break the handset. Can anyone copy me? This is urgent. Bus slammed the handset down and looked at Tomlin with alarm tweaking his features. Tomlin shook his head. Something's going on, Bus. Jerry held the dangling cable in his hand with a savage grin. He could feel the energy coursing through him like his nerves were rioting, like his blood had been set on fire. He dropped the cable and watched it droop over the mounting brackets of the radio antenna posted on the roof of the Camp Ryder building. He hadn't permanently damaged it, but simply unplugged it. After all, they might need to use it in the future. He stood up and put one leg up on the lip of the roof, looking out over Camp Ryder, nearly shaking with anticipation. Beside him stood Greg, holding the little orange flare gun. Jerry took a brief moment to grip his shotgun solidly in his hands and breathe in the crisp air from the rooftop. From up here, you could barely smell the latrines and the dirty, filthy smell of the people themselves. From up here, he felt like a god. Do it, he said. Give the signal. Greg pointed the flare gun up and shot it into the sky. At the sound of the flare gun going off, Bus bolted to the office window. What the hell was that? He said. Was that a gunshot? Angela asked, alarmed. Tomlin shook his head. I don't think so, Bus. What's going on out there? Staring out the window, Bus watched a column of 10 men running across the square towards the Camp Ryder building, rifles at the ready. I don't know. When he laid eyes on them, his insides flip-flopped around. Do you see anything? Tomlin demanded. Yeah, Bus hesitated for a moment. I think about 10 guys, running this way. They all have guns. Shit, I don't know, it doesn't look good. Bus's mind raced back and forth, dizzy with the possibilities and unable to settle on any particular explanation for what he was seeing. He just kept staring out the window, shaking his head and frowning as though it were some puzzle to be solved, even as the 10 men drew closer to the building. Movement from the front gate caught Bus's eyes. Wait a minute, he mumbled. There's a group at the front gate. The sentry is letting them in, it looks like. I think it's Professor White. Bus suddenly snapped his head towards the radio and stared at the defunct piece of equipment, and then launched himself away from the window. "Fucking Jerry," was all he said. Angela covered her mouth with her hand. "Oh my God." "What?" Tomlin almost shouted. "What's going on?" Bus reached to the top of the metal file cabinets that sat against the wall behind his desk and pulled down the M4 that Lee had given him and that he rarely carried. He shoved the M4 into Tomlin's arms, then reached back on top of the file cabinets and ripped down the shoulder bag with the 6 extra magazines. "It's Jerry. He's trying to take over." Tomlin didn't ask questions. He slung into the shoulder bag, checked the chamber of the rifle to make sure it was loaded, and snicked the safety off. He angled himself towards the door. "We can hold off a dozen guys or so, but I don't know for how long." "No," Bus snatched his old Colt 1911 out of his shoulder holster. "They took out our radio so we can't call for help." He reached out and grabbed Tomlin by the sleeve of his jacket, staring at him with laser-like focus. "You can't go out the front door. The only way out is over the roof. Can you make it?" "I can figure it out." "You've got to tell the other settlements, get some help to us, and find Captain Hardin." Tomlin nodded. Bus pushed him towards the door. "Not much time, go." Tomlin moved without hesitation. He bolted through the office door and never even asked how to get to the roof. Bus was confident that the man could do it. He looked to Angela and Vicky. "You two get out of here while you can." Angela put an arm around the other woman's shoulders and ushered her to the door, but then she only shoved her through and closed and locked the door behind her. She turned and produced a small black pistol from her waistband. "I'm sorry, I left my rifle in my shack." Bus shook his head adamantly. "You're not staying up here with me. Lee would kill me if he found out." Tears welled up in Angela's eyes. "Bus, I don't even know if Lee is alive." Bus's jaw worked hard underneath the thick, dark beard. "He's alive." From below them came the sound of a door being thrown open and people started shouting. 2 shots rang out, causing Bus and Angela both to jump and stare at each other with unabashed fear. "All right," Bus nodded. "Too late to turn back now." He grabbed the heavy desk with an underhanded grip, and with one great, growling effort he heaved the desk over onto its side. Then he crouched down behind it, and Angela joined him. "We're not gonna fight if we don't have to," Bus said. "But I'm talking face to face with Jerry before this is over." Angela only nodded, her hands trembling. They waited. Tomlin worked his way through the shadows, his heart thrashing around inside of his chest. Wild and panicked, it belied the steady, sinewy movements of his body as he crept over the catwalk that ran along the upper level and stood like a bridge across the main open area of the Camp Ryder building, where a few people still had their shanties, and most people gathered to eat their meals as a community. To the left, the catwalk dropped over a single, flimsy rail, and he could see the people milling about in panic below, as 5 of the gunmen began to surround them, firing their rifles into the roof for effect and making Tomlin pray that he didn't catch a ricochet from one of those idiots. To his right, the catwalk butted straight into the wall where a slew of pipes, air ducts, and electrical conduits ran horizontally along the 6-foot space between the catwalk and the ceiling. Straight up ahead, Tomlin could see what appeared to be the ladder that led to the roof. The clanging of metal rungs brought his attention straight ahead. Someone was climbing down from the roof. He could see their legs working quickly down the ladder. Attack or hide. Hiding gave him a narrow chance, but the only chance he had. Bus's plan was the only plan, and he suspected that even if he had more time to consider it, he wouldn't have come up with a better one. The only hope for Camp Ryder and Captain Hardin was for Tomlin to get to one of the other settlements and sound the alarm that shit was going down. He dove to the side, wedging himself between a row of 3 large pipes that sat abreast of each other, and an air duct. Panic shot through him like he'd stuck his finger in a light socket. He felt sure that he was not hidden well, that as soon as whoever was coming down from the roof passed by, they would see him sandwiched in there, and he was crammed in so tight that he wouldn't be able to defend himself. He pictured it, his arms pinned down to his side, his rifle facing harmlessly in the wrong direction, as his enemies raised their weapons and pumped round after round into him, and he would be conscious as each bullet ripped into his guts and split him open. The sound of boots struck the catwalk. Someone shouted, "Let's go, Jerry." More boots banging on the catwalk, then the sound of running, pounding, and reverberating harder and harder as it drew closer to him. Yes, keep running. If they sprinted past him, their chances of noticing him wedged into all these dark-colored pipes were pretty slim. If they would just keep running. "Wait, slow up," a new voice said, an older voice. "Shit, shit, shit. You see that?" "Yeah." Motherfuckers holed himself into the office. Relief flooded him so hard, he thought he might piss himself. The footsteps picked up the pace again, and 2 shadowy figures passed by, only inches from him. He could have reached out and touched them, and at any point in time he feared they would suddenly stop and turn to look at him, but the office held their attention. Tomlin waited until their footsteps had retreated off the catwalk, and then he scrambled to free himself from his hiding place. He twisted and turned and finally extricated himself and his rifle, although a sharp bit of welding took a nasty chunk out of his left forearm. With his feet under him, he moved as quickly and quietly as he could manage towards the ladder. So close, so close. "Hey," someone shouted, "maybe they're not yelling at me. Shoot him." The distinct barking sound of an M4 firing 3 rounds in quick succession came from below him. He wasn't sure where 2 of the rounds went, but he watched a section of cement wall to his right suddenly explode into fragments, and knew that the rounds were meant for him. All pretense of stealth immediately left him. It was do or die time. He bolted for the ladder, crossing the last dozen yards in an instant, and leaping halfway up the rungs as more rifle reports came from behind him. This time he felt the rounds, impacting close to him. He could feel the shrapnel from the cement wall stinging his face, feel the ladder lurch under him as they struck the metal. He cringed, waiting for that ricochet to find him. He kept pulling with his arms, thrusting with his feet, daylight above his head. He grabbed the lip of the roof and pulled himself up like he weighed nothing at all, then vaulted himself over the edge. He hit the ground and rolled twice, then scrambled to his hands and knees and finally to his feet. He ran towards the edge of the roof, but then stopped himself short. He looked around, gasping for air. "How do I get down? How do I get down?" The sound of shouting echoing up to him from the ladder. He scanned the entire perimeter of the roof, but didn't see anything that looked remotely like a ladder. Not even a drain pipe that he might scramble down. How high up was he? 2 stories? 3? If he busted his ankle on the way down, he'd be screwed. A banging noise, metal on metal vibrations. Someone was shimmying up the ladder. He crouched down, making a small target of himself, and brought the M4 up. An identical rifle to his own suddenly protruded from the hole in the roof, and it began spitting out bright tongues of flame, the operator of the weapon blindly firing over the edge, hoping to strike something. But he'd chosen the wrong direction and was firing uselessly off to Tomlin's left. Tomlin snapped off 1 round and watched the rifle fly out of its owner's grip as the bullet struck it right in the receiver. From the ladder came a yelp of surprise and pain. Should hold them off for a second. His options were dwindling quickly. It was either jump or eventually get waxed by an enterprising individual that chose to pop up from the ladder at just the right time when Tomlin wasn't looking. He wouldn't last on the roof forever. He ran to the edge of the roof and looked down. It looked more like 10 stories than the 2 or 3 it was. He'd never been a fan of heights. Lucky for him, he was facing the backside of the building, and there before him was the very same shipping container that he had escaped from, maybe 5 or 10 feet off the side of the building. It would cut down on the distance he would have to fall and lessen his risk of injury. More shouting from behind him. Now or never. He backed up a few paces to get himself a running start, then flung himself over the edge. He thought the drop was going to take much longer, but the top of the shipping container rushed at him with surprising speed, and he didn't quite have enough time to set himself up for a good landing. He hit the top of it with an explosive noise and immediately pitched forward. He was too close to the edge. He tumbled off the shipping container and hit the ground on his side, the magazines in the shoulder sling jabbing mercilessly at his side and sending shooting pains through his ribs. He felt the air leave his lungs and refused to go back in, his shocked diaphragm locked in position. Got the wind knocked out, it'll come back. He hobbled to his feet, feeling woozy and hoping his breath came back sooner rather than later. His vision swirled just slightly, and then found its correct spot and became solid reality again. He ran straight forward, toward the fence, and all the while looked up at it with his mouth hanging open, getting small breaths into his lungs and gradually working them into larger breaths. Barbed wire fences. He wasn't going to climb that shit. He glanced behind him, saw that there were no immediate threats, yet, and then turned back to the fence he was running towards, trying to find a point where he might make it through. For the most part, the bottom of the fence touched the ground, and in some places the dirt had built up and swallowed the first few rows of links. But just to his right, there was a section where erosion had carved miniature canyon into the dirt. The ground cleared the bottom of the fence by a few inches. A few inches would have to be enough. Tomlin knew instantly he wasn't getting under that fence with the rifle and spare magazines, but there wasn't a chance in hell he was leaving them behind. He shucked off the shoulder bag and slung it as hard as he could over the top of the fence, and then did the same with the rifle. The two objects cleared the barbed wire and clattered down a few yards into the woods. He dove to the ground, his hands splayed out in front of him, trying to sweep the bottom of the chain-link fence away from his head. He was only partially successful, getting most of his head through before the bottom of the fence swung back into place and gouged him from the ears to the neck, and then caught on his clothes. Tomlin writhed under the pressure of the fence, only gaining inches with each movement, feeling panic welling up and not fighting that feeling. This was no fine motor skill that required a clear head. It was not a critical decision of what was a threat and what was not a threat. This was just an animal trying to get out of a trap, and if there was any time in the world to panic, it was then. He cleared his upper body, then dug his fingers into the soft dirt and clawed himself all the way free of the fence. And when he was free, he didn't stop to look back or to assess the damages. He lurched to his feet and pointed himself straight into those woods. As he ran, he scooped up the rifle and shoulder bag and flew as fast as his feet would carry him. Chapter 31, JERRY. The pounding at the office door continued for nearly 30 seconds straight. Crouched behind the overturned desk, Bus and Angela stared at the door and wondered how long it would last once the men on the other side started kicking. The pounding now was only someone's fist. It was a big, industrial door with a metal frame and would not come down easily, but it would eventually. And then what? Bus thought. The hammering fist ceased, and a voice that was only vaguely familiar came through, slightly out of breath. Bus, you need to come out of there before we come in and get you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Bus grit his teeth and shook his head but didn't respond. Angela watched him quietly and adjusted the grip on her pistol. "Bus," the voice called again. "Greg, was that his name? Are you armed?" "Of course I'm fucking armed," Bus yelled at the door. "Where's Jerry? Let him speak for himself. He wants to take this place over. He can come look me in the eyes and we'll talk it over." This time it was Jerry's voice that came through the door. Lilting, proud, bitter, engorged with his own perception of victory. "I'm here, Bus, waiting for you to open the door if you really want to face me like a man. But there will be no talking this over. We're through with talking. You've pushed us into this position, so don't bitch now that we're taking control." Bus hung his head for a moment and there was silence between him and the people on the other side of the door. How many were out there? 5, 10, all armed. And Jerry especially. Wouldn't Jerry enjoy it if they had to get in a shootout? Because there was really only one outcome to that. "Bus, we are trying to handle this with as little violence as possible," Jerry intoned self-righteously, as though this whole situation was Bus's fault. "But you're making it very difficult. And the longer you hole up in there, the more likely it is that someone is going to get hurt." Bus closed his eyes, rubbed them. When he opened them, he looked at Angela with a strangely serene look on his face. "You know, Angela, when I first met you, I never would have imagined one day we'd be barricaded in this office, holding guns." Angela looked grim, and yet here we are. Bus actually laughed, as though the situation was some comedic story he was hearing about third hand. "Yes, here we are. I'll tell you what," Jerry shouted through the door. "I've given you plenty of chances to handle this like an adult and face the music. I'm giving you 1 minute to open this fucking door before we break it down. And then whatever happens will be on your head, not mine. You hear me, Bus? It's your fault. It's always been your fucking fault, and it's gonna be your fault again. Open the fucking door." Bus almost winced at the sound of the man's shouts, as though his voice were a particularly ear-piercing and high-pitched noise that you could feel in the fillings of your teeth and down the skin over your spine. When the room grew quiet again, he sighed quietly. "You've got a lot of fight, Angela." He looked at the pistol in his hands. "Probably a lot more than I ever gave you credit for." "Bus," she said, licking her lips nervously, "maybe we should." "Here," Bus held out his hand. "Let me have your gun." She stared at him like he was nuts. "Come on, let me see it for a second." Slowly she held the pistol out to him and dropped the heavy metallic object in his outstretched hand. Bus looked at it like some alien artifact he didn't quite comprehend, and then he stood up from behind the desk. "What are you doing?" Angela asked, a note of apprehension coming into her voice. Bus ejected the magazine of her gun and jacked the round from the chamber. He looked at her with a sad smile, and then tossed her weapon on the floor so that it skittered away into the other corner of the room. "Bus!" Angela stood up like she was going to make a leap for the gun. The big man held out one giant paw to stay her, and when she was firmly rooted behind the desk again, he retracted his hand and tossed his own weapon to the ground alongside Angela's. He shook his head. "We've survived this long. I'm certainly not going to be taken out now by this motherfucker." "Open the door, Bus," Jerry taunted. Angela and Bus regarded each other for a long moment, but both knew that it was the right decision. This did not have to end in bloodshed, and Bus would do the people of Camp Ryder a disservice by making a useless sacrifice of himself. He reached forward and unlocked the door, and then stepped back. It took the men on the other side a moment to comprehend what he'd done, but then the door flew open and 2 men burst through, shouting and pointing their rifles at Angela and Bus, yelling at them to raise their hands. The man, it was Greg after all, that pointed his rifle at Bus, stepped to one side, and behind him Jerry stood in the door of the office, staring balefully at Bus from under scowling eyebrows, and pointing his sawed-off shotgun at him. For a moment, Bus's heart jumped, thinking that Jerry was just going to shoot him dead right then and there. But no, Jerry didn't have the sack for such an overt act of violence. Jerry was a politician, and he knew that even though his supporters disliked Bus, they wouldn't look at it very kindly if Jerry gunned him down for no reason. Jerry stepped forward and raised his head up so that he was looking down his nose at Bus, and he sneered, the picture of haughty defiance. "Get on your knees, Bus." Bus shook his head. "Why are you doing this?" Jerry leapt forward, but still left about a foot between the muzzle of his shotgun and Bus's chest. "Because you fucked us over, Bus. You have us running around like lackeys for that G.I. Joe, giving everything we have to his mission. You just let 20 of our group, 20 innocent people, march out of Camp Ryder on a fucking suicide run to God knows where, to do God knows what, all because the great Captain Hardin said it was a good idea." Jerry's face was a contorted mask of rage. "You're fucking pathetic. Pathetic." Bus laughed in his face. "And what are you going to do, hero? What's your master plan for all of this? Run and hide. Wait for it to be over." The smile on Bus's face dissolved abruptly into a snarl. "Because I have news for you. It's not going to be over. You're not going to be able to wait it out." "Shut up," Jerry shrieked. "You think you can just wait for them to die, but you can't. They're just getting stronger." "Shut the fuck up." "And they're breeding. They're breeding, Jerry." Bus took a step forward and reached towards Jerry in a supplicating gesture. The shotgun blast shook the room like an explosion had gone off underneath their feet. The twin barrels flashed bright, hot, violent smoke, and Bus toppled backwards like some invisible force had yanked him to the ground. "Bus!" Angela screamed, and shoved past the man guarding her, who stood with his eyes as wide in shock as everyone else in the room, their panic-stricken gazes crossing rapidly between Bus's figure on the ground and Jerry who stood over him, his eyes wild and glistening like a mad man. It seemed to take Jerry a moment to realize what he had done. For a moment so fleeting that it seemed to have been only a trick of the light shifting through the cloud of gunsmoke that hung in the air before him, Jerry looked terrified. "Did you see that?" Jerry began screaming. "He tried to grab my gun, you saw that, didn't you? Greg, you saw him try to grab my gun. I had to shoot him. He was trying to grab my gun so he could shoot me. I had to do it." Greg stood, petrified in place. His mouth worked and he could find neither the courage to tell the truth, that there had been no aggressive movement on Bus's part, that Jerry had shot him in cold blood, nor the intestinal fortitude to directly affirm Jerry's lie. Angela fell to her knees at Bus's side. "Bus, somebody get help. Help him." The big man lay on his back, his eyes wide in surprise, staring at the ceiling, as his chest hitched up and down, all the brawn of it mangled under the tattered and bloody remnants of his jacket. Strange noises came from him, from his mouth, and from the air seeping through his lungs and directly out of his chest. No one in the room moved or ran for help, partially because they were unsure how Jerry would react, but also because they all knew that no amount of medical help would save Bus from what was coming. Angela put her hand on his brow and smoothed back the dark curls of his hair. Hot brine welled in her eyes and her breath was becoming ragged with sobs. "Bus, look at me. Look at me. You're not gonna die. You're gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay, just fucking look at me." As though he had not heard her until this last pained request, his eyes focused just slightly and moved down to meet her tearful gaze. His head came up off the ground with what appeared to be every ounce of effort he had within his body, and he stared at her with shocking intensity for someone so close to death. "Take it," he said. "Take it. You have to." And then his eyes became unfocused again, and he collapsed backwards into unconsciousness, his face shedding its color like a tree shedding the bright autumn leaves to welcome the cold barrenness of winter. The hitching of his chest became more rapid, and then it slowed, and the last sound that came from him was a slow and beleaguered groan, like the sound of a steel structure giving way under an immense pressure. Angela squeezed her eyes shut, felt the tears trickling down her face. She whirled on Jerry. "You fucking murdered him!" Jerry shouted angrily back at her. "He tried to grab my gun. What was I supposed to do?" "You're a fucking liar." She pointed her finger in a broad, sweeping gesture. "And you're all fucking cowards for letting him do it. Murderers and cowards." Jerry's sneer returned to his face like stagnant water freezing over. "Tie her up and find some place to put her. Some place where she won't be heard." Moving slowly, still in shock, two men took Angela by the arms and placed them behind her back. One held them clasped there while the other began to restrain her with thin cordage that bit painfully into her skin. The anger and disbelief were suddenly vaporized in an explosion of thoughts for her daughter, for Abby, and for Sam. "Jerry, I've got children. You can't do this." "I'll make sure they're taken care of," he said quietly. "Perhaps when you decide to calm down, you can see them again." Angela began to pull against her bindings, but they'd already been tied too tight. "I've got to see my daughter. You can't do this. Let me see my daughter. Let me see Abby." Jerry gave her one last look of disdain, strangely tainted with remorse, and then shook his head. "Get her out of my office." Angela screamed bloody murder and thrashed wildly as they carried her out, until they managed to gag her and safely lock her in the very same shipping container that Tomlin had occupied, only a day before. When the people of Camp Ryder saw Angela being dragged past them, kicking and screaming, they averted their eyes or simply shook their heads because they knew that her loyalties were to Bus and Captain Hardin, and most of them that remained supported Jerry. They looked on, scared and unsure, and some of them thought it was shameful to see such a nice lady treated like that, but none of them lifted a finger to do anything about it, because they were sure that Jerry had his reasons for doing what he did. This would be the new Camp Ryder, and they trusted in Jerry, that he had made the right decision, no matter what it was. Now they had hope for their future. Now, things would change for the better. No more of Captain Hardin's warmongering. No more sending their people out to die for reasons they couldn't understand. No more of Bus wasting their precious resources on refugees that had no right to them. Yes, everything would be better now that Jerry had taken control. LaRouche stood with his feet on the double yellow line running down the center of the highway. He faced south, his head tilted up as though scanning the skies for evil portents of things to come. A bloody sun splattered the western sky with red, a bleeding heart viewed through an open wound. The shadow of the day covered them with a cadaverous chill, and LaRouche zipped up the collar of the micro-fleece sweater he wore under his jacket to cover his exposed neck. His eyes remained affixed to some elevated object in front of him. Jim's voice was shaky beside him. "Should we take them down?" LaRouche blinked, without words. They stood on a section of highway just outside of Fremont. To the south, a narrow but well-traveled dirt road led away from the main highway, and presumably to the camp that the man with the convoy of 2 pickup trucks had escaped from. Beginning there at the dirt road, and extending east along the highway at intervals of perhaps 300 feet, were wooden utility poles sunk into the dirt along the shoulder. Upon these poles were hung the naked bodies of 10 men, some of them young, some of them older. They were hung upon crossbeams of 2x4s, spiked through their wrists and feet, and the crossbeams lashed to the poles with rope and wire. It was exactly as the man had described. The aspect of their deaths that the man had been unable to describe was the disembowelment. The executors had not simply hung the victims and left them to die, but had slit them across the bottom of their midsections, just below their navels. Their carcasses hung hollow on the crosses, their insides piled below them at the base of the pole, tethered to them only by the pale linkage of unraveled intestine. Hung around the neck of each body were placards on which a single word had been printed: unrepentant. La Rouche put a fist to his mouth and swallowed hard. The air was filled with stenches unimaginable, and he could feel the acid of his stomach eking up his throat, a prodding nausea insistent that he purge himself. His gaze traveled down the road. On the side of the road, perhaps 25 yards from La Rouche, lay the bodies of 3 infected that had been tearing at the bodies like carrion eaters before the convoy had arrived and gunned them down. The 4th of their small pack had fled into the woods, wounded in the leg. Finally, La Rouche fought down the urge to vomit enough to speak. "No, leave them." He turned and faced Jim, whose eyes were filled with tears and who looked like he was struggling to contain his own stomach. "We don't have time to bury them all before dark, and they might serve to warn away anyone traveling east." Jim nodded, trembled. "Except us." La Rouche didn't respond. Wilson leaned out of the lead Humvee just a few yards behind them. "Sarge, I can't get anyone from Camp Ryder to respond." La Rouche looked at the dark-skinned man and considered this for a moment. "I'm sure they're just missing the transmission. They're probably," he swallowed again, "eating dinner." "Do you want me to keep trying?" Wilson asked, his voice sounding vacant. "We'll try again in a little while." La Rouche turned back towards the south, but he could not look at the crucified bodies again. Jim spoke. "What do we do now?" A cold wind blew from the north and buffeted against their backs. It scrubbed away the foul stenches like whitewash clearing a canvas to a blank slate. But it was only so that new and unknown horrors could be painted on it. It froze them to their cores, and its soft voice whispered of an end to the things they knew and a beginning of long, dark months ahead, of changes that would not only reshape them as people, but would also reshape the world around them. "We keep going," La Rouche said quietly. "We complete the mission, whatever it takes." Chapter 32. What Kill You? Images of flashing smoke and burning sparks, conforming to roiling towers of flame that reached for him, seared his eyes and puckered his flesh, and melted into vast fields of lava flow that distorted his vision with heat like the surface of the sun. He felt the right side of his head melting, hot and tingling at first, and then cold and clammy. A beast appeared before him, its breath hot and rank, and it gnashed its teeth at him and began to eat the melted portion of his head. He did not react to this because it did not make sense, and it could only be a part of some strange death dream. Behind the beast that fed on him, he could see random crisscrossing patterns of light and dark, slate gray and deep navy blue. The dark shapes clawed at the corners of his vision. The gray took the center and gave way to the flailing talons of these dark creatures. In the immensity of the gray stood a lonesome spark that burned, and throbbed. Slowly, dreamily, he reached up and pushed the beast away from him, because he could not bear the sensation of it eating his melted head any longer. Like a series of firecrackers going off along a lit fuse, the truth began to light up his mind, beginning with the feeling of fur. Fur. Dog's fur. Not a beast. Deuce. He wasn't gnashing at him, he was barking. Lee touched the side of his head that he thought had melted and felt it was intact, save for a raised, fleshy groove that stung at the prodding of his fingertips and caused him to jerk his hand back. Deuce continued to wail and bark and whine at him, and this was not truly registering with him just yet. He was dead. He was dead. He had been shot in the head. This couldn't be real. He forced his fingers once again to the ragged wound that ran along his scalp from the hairline of his right temple to the back of his head, behind his ear. The pain cleared his mind, but only slightly. It burned badly now, the only sensation of coolness coming from the evaporation of Deuce's saliva as he dutifully licked his master's wound. Sometimes the bullet skips off the skull, Lee heard himself say, as though it was some fleeting memory of a past life. The barking. The barking. The barking meant there were infected near. Lee blinked rapidly, trying to clear his head, trying to organize a million thoughts that screamed at him for his attention. No, he could not give them his attention. He could not think about Eddie Ramirez or betrayal or Abe Daraby or shit. Where's my GPS? In his pack. In the Humvee that was long gone. Son of a bitch. But he was here, he was now, and that GPS was somewhere else. He had a different set of problems that he needed to solve first. There was the present to worry about, and presently there were infected nearby. Infected. Infected, Lee forced himself to focus. Compartmentalize. Deuce had turned himself so that his stiff and fearful tail was nearly touching Lee, and he faced into the woods, barking savagely. Weapon, of course not. He leaned upwards, felt dizzy for a moment, saw sparkles at the edge of his vision, and a massive, nearly debilitating headache throbbed through his skull. Perhaps a fracture, perhaps a concussion, perhaps swelling on the brain that would kill him momentarily anyway. Can you even be conscious and have brain swelling? He didn't think so. He felt around on the ground, searched it with his eyes, but found nothing but rocks and dirt. Then he felt his vest, still strapped to him. His magazines remained in place, along with his car. Eddie Ramirez must have shot him and just kicked him out of the driver's seat and into the road. If he had bothered to take the time to search the body, maybe he would have discovered that Lee was not actually dead. No, I'm fucking alive. I'm alive. He felt exultant, but the feeling was quickly clouded over by pain and more confusing thoughts, like the impact of the glancing bullet strike on his skull had rearranged some wires inside his head, and now things were not processing correctly. Weapon, he repeated in his mind. The only weapon he had was his car. He ripped it from its sheath and held it firmly in his right hand. The dog at his side continued to bark ferociously at the darkening woods. The sun was setting. Dusk was taking over. It was cold. Soon it would be dark, and it would be even colder. He had no food, no water, no shelter, and he was unsure how long his body would hold out. He was unsure how much damage the round had done to his head. He knew other soldiers that had caught rounds to the head and survived. Some of them were normal. Others had trouble speaking. Some were paraplegics. As though testing that last theory, he rolled onto his hands and knees and with some effort pulled one of his feet underneath him. Everything hurt, excruciatingly. At least I can move. I can move, and I have a knife. He took a deep breath to steady himself. If you can move and you have a knife, you can run and you can fight. Deuce was backing away from the wood line, nearly in a panic. They were close now. It was time to run.